Welcome again to Late Night Parents. This is Ted Hicks. Ways to follow the podcast, latenightparents.com, or you can follow me on Twitter, The Real Ted Hicks. Ways Dr. King speaks to us today. Every hero becomes a bore at last. That's the famous line from the 19th century philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. But it could also apply to a modern American hero, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. As the nation celebrates King's national holiday, it's easy to freeze-frame him as the benevolent dreamer carved in stone on the Washington Mall. Yet the platitudes that frame many of King's holiday events fail to mention the most radical aspects of his legacy. We turn him into a Thanksgiving float. He's jolly, he's larger than life, he makes us feel good. We've turned him into a mascot. Many people vaguely know Dr. King opposed the Vietnam War and talked more about poverty in his later years. But King also had a lot to say about the issues not normally associated with civil rights that still resonate today, historians and activists say. If you're concerned with health care, climate change, inequality, or even the nastiness of our political disagreements, then King has plenty to say to you. To see that version of Dr. King, though, we might have to dust off the cliches and look at him anew. If you're more familiar with your smartphone than your history, try this. Think of King not just as a civil rights hero, but as an app. His legacy needs to be updated to remain relevant. Here are 3 ways that we can update our MLK app to see how he spoke not only to his time, but to our time as well. Number 1, he's an environmental hero. When former Attorney General Eric Holder spoke at the King commemorative event in 2011, he described King in an unusual way. King, he said, helped plant the seeds of what would become our nation's now thriving environmental justice movement. People don't think of King as an ecological activist. He didn't live long enough to see the environmental movement take off. He died just a few months before the Apollo 8 astronauts took the iconic Earthrise photo over the moon, which is often credited with sparking widespread environmental awareness. But he still inspires environmental activists because they say he was so eloquently and articulating a core belief of their movement, the interconnected nature of life. One of the most difficult challenges climate change activists face today is convincing political and business leaders to act on behalf of future generations of people in other parts of the world. King, though, offered a great example of how to address this challenge, some say. He constantly talked about the interconnectedness of life. In his A Christmas Sermon on Peace, just 5 months before his assassination, King delivered one of his most famous quotes. All life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Some even describe Dr. King as an ecological hero. Activist and author Drew Dillinger says King's insight is profound. That's the essence of ecology. The first law of ecology is that everything is connected. Other environmental activists noticed Dr. King as well. In his essay, Dillinger cites Larry L. Rasmussen, the author of Earth Honoring Faith, describing King as one of the great ecological thinkers of the 20th century. King wrote more about nature and how fragile life is on Earth than we realize. King once warned that cities are gasping in polluted air and enduring contaminated water. Dillinger also cites this quote from King. It would be foolhardy for me to work for integrated schools or integrated lunch counters and not be concerned about the survival of the world in which to be integrated. When he was pouring through King's sermons and books, Dillinger says he discovered constant references to science and nature. He came across note cards written in King's hand rhapsodizing about all this galaxy of wonder and the stars that guide sailors in storms. There's a connection between what Dr. King was saying in the 1950s and 60s and the explosion of ecological thinking that emerged around 1970, where everyone was saying it's all about interconnectedness. Gwen Keyes Fleming, a former EPA regional administrator, wrote about Dr. King's environmental legacy, says Dr. King inspired a generation of activists in the 1970s and 80s who fought more to remove landfills than had been placed in or near communities of color. If you go back to the beginnings of the environmental justice movement, a lot of these folks were active civil rights advocates at the time. Even Congressman John Lewis said that environmental justice is one of the modern civil issues of our time. Number 2, Dr. King was a socialist before it was cool. There was a time in American politics when calling someone a socialist was a slur. Not anymore for many younger Americans who are developing a distrust of capitalism. One of the most popular politicians in recent times is Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, a self-described Democratic socialist who almost captured the Democratic nomination for president. And a 2016 Harvard University poll says 51% of young Americans aged 18 to 29 oppose capitalism. And a poll conducted by the next year by YouGov and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation found that most American millennials prefer to live in a socialist country than a capitalistic one. The reasons why some millennials prefer socialism have been documented. Lingering scars from the Great Recession, staggering student debt, the greatest economic inequalities since before the Great Depression have all contributed to an unease about capitalism. Dr. King has similar misgivings. Many historians describe him as a democratic socialist, someone who, according to the Democratic Socialists of America, believes the economy should be shaped to meet public needs and not to make profits for a few. Dr. King called for universal health care and education, a guaranteed annual income, and nationalization of some industries. He was a big supporter of unions, and while there was no fight for 15 to raise the minimum wage during this time, he once said that even menial workers should make enough so they can live and educate their children and buy a home and have the basic necessities of life. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, he was about to lead a multiracial army of poor people into Washington to force the nation's political leaders to address poverty. He saw that changing the laws was important, but that was not itself sufficient. There, he had to be a sort of redistribution of economic power. How radical was Dr. King's vision? He spelled it out on many occasions. In 1968, he told the church audience, it didn't cost the nation a penny to open lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation a penny to give us the right to vote. But it cost the nation billions to feed and house all of its citizens. The country needs a radical redistribution of wealth. In a 1966 speech to his staff, Dr. King said, there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism. In 1964, after traveling to Norway to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. King said, in both Norway and Sweden, whose economies are literally dwarfed by the size of our influence and extent of our technology, they have no unemployment and no slums. There, men, women, and children have long enjoyed free medical care and quality education. This is a contrast to the limited, halting steps taken by our rich nation that deeply troubled him. Even one of those utopian visions, a guaranteed income, is getting serious discussion today because of the fears that automation will erase many jobs. There's even a new proposal to give every newborn in the U.S. baby bonds, accounts between $550,000 that parents couldn't touch until their kids turn 18, as a way to combat the inequalities that we deal with today. There are those who say King gravitated toward socialism later in his life, but many Americans today said he saw its possibilities first as a young man. In a letter to his future wife, Coretta, at 20-something, King wrote, "I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory about capitalistic. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness, and it has brought about a system that takes the necessities from the masses and gives luxury to the classes." Number 3, Dr. King never let a political disagreement turn nasty. Reverend Dr. Chicken Wing, a religious Uncle Tom, a traitor, and a chump. That's how one prominent black leader described Dr. King when he was alive. That leader was Malcolm X. While his denunciations of Dr. King and other leaders is well known, here's a remarkable fact. There is virtually no record of Dr. King making a personal or petty attack against Malcolm X or any other black leader who criticized him. This could be an important lesson at a time of bitter political divisions, which are often made worse by social media. 2 contemporary leaders in the civil rights movement recently got into a Twitter feud and that turned personal. The clash between Cornel West and Ta-Nehisi Coates revolved around political philosophy, but it became so heated that Coates ended up deleting his Twitter account. King received a cascade of petty insults from Malcolm X and other black leaders during his time, but King's faith tempered his response. He was a Christian minister, and he talked about trying to love segregationalists, and if you have empathy for your enemies, you can also do that with your rivals in civil rights organizations. There was also a pragmatic side of King's reluctance to get pulled into public feuds. It preserved alliances and kept doors open to new allies, including Malcolm X. After Malcolm X broke with the Nation of Islam in 1964, he started reaching out to King and other civil rights leaders. He traveled to Selma, Alabama in 1965, where King was leading a march to Montgomery to offer support. A friend of Malcolm once said that the former Nation of Islam leader believed King was the most responsive of all the civil rights leaders to his efforts to reconcile. He had come to believe that Dr. King believed in what he was doing. He believed in nonviolence, and it wasn't just a show. He developed respect for him and heard that you have to give respect to men to put their lives on the line. The respect was mutual. When Dr. King later learned that Malcolm X had come to Selma to support him, he was quoted as saying, "Hey, Malcolm's a beautiful brother." He always had a deep affection for Malcolm. Malcolm X obviously, challenged and did say many unkind words about Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, but their disagreements never turned personal or nasty. King's nature didn't just help him deal with other black leaders' insults. It also helped him deal with something people today may find harder to believe. He was persistently unpopular during his lifetime. One of the things that the people erase from history is how unpopular and scared of Dr. King most Americans were during his time. I'm not just talking about in 67, 68. I'm talking about in the early 60s. The 1963 March on Washington In his I Have a Dream speech, polls show that most Americans did not approve of the march, and the following year, well before the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, a New York Times poll showed that most Americans thought the civil rights movement had gone too far. The U.S. government thought Dr. King was so dangerous, they treated him like an enemy of the state. We now see his March on Washington speech as the greatest American speech of the 20th century. But we're uncomfortable grappling with the fact that this is a moment that the FBI decided to have wall-to-wall surveillance of Dr. King. Today we have wall-to-wall celebrations about Dr. King. He is now on par with American titans like Presidents George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Americans write tributes and sing songs of how much Dr. King changed America. But here's one more uncomfortable thought that's always, that also explains why Dr. King remains so relevant. The country is still divided by the same issues that consumed him. On his last night of his life, Dr. King told a shouting congregation of black churchgoers that we as a people, we get to the promised land. That kind of optimism, though, sounds like it belongs to another era. What we have now is a leader in the White House who denies widespread reports that he complained about Latino and African immigrants coming to S-hole countries, a white supremacist who murders worshipers in the church, a social media landscape that pulsates with anger and accusations. King's promised land doesn't sound boring when you compare to today's headlines, and maybe that's what's so sad about reliving his life every January for some people. 50 years after he died, Dr. King's vision of America still sounds so far away.